Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Friday's session on Leonard Peikoff's essays. Today, we'll have the pleasure of breaking down Reason, Emotion, and the Arbitrary, which was published in the Objectivist Forum. So before we start, my first impression reading through this essay was that it is very similar to Chapter 5 of OPAR, Objectivism, the Philosophy of Ayn Rand, and that definitely took my attention. But also, the arbitrary is one of the distinguishing characteristics of objectivism. For example, when I was first contemplating religion, for example, I never took it seriously, but it was not until I read OPAR where I had a formal argument and proper refutation of religion. So with me today is James Valliant, who is very much an expert in objectivism and objectivist epistemology. And without further ado, I wanted to get us started on the context of this essay. When was it written? Was it written before OPAR? And how did it influence the writing of the OPAR, James?
By the mid-1980s, Dr. Leonard Peikoff had started outlining and preparing material for his magnificent treatise, his comprehensive treatise on the philosophy of Ayn Rand, Objectivism, the philosophy of Ayn Rand, which wasn't published until the early 90s. And this chapter, published in the Objectivist Forum, as you say, in 1987, it's not the full chapter, it's sort of an abbreviated, he focuses on the essential stuff he wants to zero in on here, but it's basically chapter 5 of Objectivism, the philosophy of Ayn Rand. The content is really substantially the same. There are some minor edits. He reorganized the order of some material. He added a little material to make it make sense here, but he puts in ellipses where the material in OPAR continues, so you know that he's got a further discussion of it. But this zeroes in on the specific issue here of the relationship between reason and the arbitrary versus or emotions in the arbitrary versus reason. And you're absolutely right. It is a distinctive idea quite distinctive to objectivist epistemology. We have the example you use in religion, we have a very definite response to agnosticism, for example, which is not to be found in other theories of modern philosophy on these epistemological issues. I'm sure we'll get to it. But you're absolutely right. It's a very distinctive approach that excludes caprice and the whim in any form from human cognition.
Mm-hmm. And straight away, I also wanted to marvel once again at how we can connect this essay to other essays that previously featured on this program, like Certainty and Happiness. Maybe You're Wrong. This strengthens, if anything, the integration between various ideas in objectivism. We had the pleasure of doing a course, Objectivism through induction, where in the last lesson we inductively induce the idea of the arbitrary and what gives rise to the need of even having such a concept as the arbitrary. So I know that that's not what Peikoff does in this essay, but this is something that Harry Binswanger also likes to do. He likes to ask which facts of reality give rise to this concept. So if I was to ask you, James, what facts of reality give rise to the concept arbitrary, what would you say?
I would say human volition is really what it comes down to. The level of sense perception, the level of observation works automatically. And we can, with our words, we can conceptually misidentify and make mistakes about the perceptual, but the perceptual is valid. If you're perceiving reality, it's automatic. It takes no choice or effort on your part. I can't give you any advice on how to do that. The conceptual level, on the other hand, is not like that. The conceptual level works volitionally. And because it can work volitionally, it is subject to a kind of error, non-objectivity, that perceptual data is not. And so, metaphysically speaking, only existence exists. That is to say, until and unless something has actual evidence for it, it is not even entered into the realm of something we can process. If I assert something brazenly, and that's what the arbitrary means. Dr. Peikoff defines it as an assertion given without any cognitive basis, zero evidence offered on its behalf, and no logical inference, obviously, from any evidence offered on its behalf. It's just asserted. Maybe there is a, or there is a. And these claims are, as he points out in the first part, emotion-based. The other psychological factor is that since only existence exists, and therefore only evidence can stimulate or be part of any valid process of cognition, we can volitionally choose not to do that at the conceptual level, right? Furthermore, if we are unaware of the source of our emotions, and if we take our emotions as a basis for belief, then, of course, we are cut off and adrift in any cognitive process. I cannot, until there's some connection to the rest of my knowledge, until there's some evidence for it, there's no way to connect this arbitrary idea to the rest of my cognition. I cannot, it doesn't have a place in the hierarchy. I can't reduce it to observation. It has no, I have no way to connect it logically, to integrate it with the rest of my knowledge. It simply cannot be processed cognitively. But humans will do that. Humans can do that because of this other factor in their psychology, emotions. People have all kinds of beliefs that are really emotion-based, but they'll provide some indirect, they don't state it outright, I'm just believing my emotions. They'll say something like horoscopes, crystal balls, ESP, my divine revelation, or whatever it is. And none of these really are logical, none of these are really cognitive, none of these reduce it to the evidence. So they really have no connection to reality. The only reason why people believe it, and whether it's crystal balls, horoscopes, you name it, are emotions. They feel it. They want to believe it. And of course, wanting to believe something and letting emotions enter into your cognition in that way, in any way, is the very essence of distortion, subjective distortion and bias. And so while objectivism, in the first part of the essay, is also very, very important. And so while objectivism rejects emotions as a tool of cognition, objectivism is not against emotions by any means. Emotions are vital to motivation. They're vital to enjoying life. They're vital to my whole well-being. Furthermore, they even serve an important psychoepistemological function, just not a directly cognitive one. We have to distinguish, not set aside, but distinguish emotions from a cognitive process. And that, and of course, before chapter 5 of Opart, he's sort of assuming all of this, the validity of the senses, how concepts are related to the material provided by the senses, and the basis of logic. Once you've established that and how that is a valid means, any attempt to believe something must be, there's only one other psychological function left in the mind, emotions. And that's the only basis really in our consciousness, these crystal balls, tea leaves, whatever they are, can boil down to. Now we ask ourselves, when someone makes an assertion, assertions based purely on emotion, without evidence, are common. People make them all the time, whether they're philosophy PhDs or ordinary guys on the street. People make assertions, this is what I feel, and I just believe it because I feel it. How do you deal with that? Well, if it's truly absent any evidence, if it's truly outside of any possibility of cognitive processing, it is to be dismissed out of hand. It is to be dismissed out of hand. There is nothing we can do with it. Speculative, guesswork, hunchy, arbitrary, whimsical assertions can be infinite. One of the recent examples in modern culture, contemporary culture, South Park, the television animated television show from America, postulated the flying spaghetti monster when it was talking about arguments for God. Well, the flying spaghetti monster, until and unless there's some evidence for the flying, some reason to believe that there might be a flying spaghetti monster, the idea of a flying spaghetti monster is to be dismissed out of hand as though nothing had been said. And this I need to really stress and come down on hard. If a parrot, imitating what he has heard people say, squawks out 1 + 1 = 2, that does not make the parrot a mathematician. It is simply a noise. We must treat the arbitrary precisely like that, for it has no greater significance, no different significance than a parrot squawking, because there is no connection to evidence. There is no connection to any real cognitive context, and therefore must be dismissed out of hand and treated as though nothing had been said, or it's just the equivalent of a parrot squawking. And that is really the status of it. And this includes possibilities. You know, one of the problems is that people recognize that you can't prove a negative in logic. Since the time of Aristotle, people have understood that you can't prove a negative. The fact, we go back to the idea that existence exists and only existence exists. The fact that there are no invisible elves in this room right now with me will leave no traces, because it's not true. The non-existent leaves no, if I say, was there a mouse in the room next door? The non-mouseness will not leave traces, will not leave evidence, precisely because it wasn't there. You're not going to find, if there was a mouse there, I might find a mouse scratchings, a mouse hole, mouse droppings, crumbs from mouse eating, or mouse fur. No. But if there's no mouse in the room, the absence of evidence is all the evidence you're ever going to get. There is no further evidence to find. Only existence exists. And when it comes to an assertion of a positive thing, God exists, for example, people understand you can't prove a negative. That they will sometimes grasp right off the bat. But when it comes to possibilities, people treat it differently. Well, maybe it's possible there's a God. Maybe there's this ghost or this invisible elf or whatever it is, the flying spaghetti monster. And they give credence to this maybe. Well, even maybes can be arbitrary. To say maybe is to say something about it. There is some evidence for it. Until and unless there is some evidence for it, it's not even a maybe. To say something is true, obviously, is an assertion. To say that it's probable is even a pretty strong assertion. But even to say something is just possible is to make a cognitive assertion. First, metaphysically, not everything is possible. 1 + 1 will not equal 3. The next time I sneeze, I will not turn into a pumpkin on Venus. Not everything is possible. To be possible requires demonstration. Even the possible requires demonstration and some contact. Now, possible, probable, and certain are assessments of evidence. In the absence of any evidence, you can't say that something is even possible. So if someone says, connecting it to one of our earlier essay discussions, maybe you're wrong, where Dr. Peikoff directly addresses this issue, and especially how it got modern philosophy off on the wrong foot. Consider Descartes. He doesn't mention it in this. It's probably not worth it, no part to mention Descartes. But the fact of the matter is that the whole of modern philosophy got off onto the wrong footing, to a perverse course, by accepting the possibility of the arbitrary, or arbitrary possibilities. And so Descartes went around doubting everything. Maybe we're living in, the equivalent of a matrix, without a glitch. And maybe it's an evil demon deceiving me instead of a benevolent God out there making everything work out. So what Descartes did is he made it a serious reality in the minds of modern philosophy that we can entertain arbitrary possibilities. And that, of course, is a complete perversion. None of our knowledge is certain if that's the case. I can always invent a maybe you're wrong possibility, and it's infinite. It truly is. There's really no end to the infinite possibilities that I could infinite is a potentiality, not an actuality. But there's really no end. There's an open-ended category of things. Yeah, maybe, yeah, we are in a matrix, without the slightest glitch, so no one would have any basis of even knowing that we're trapped in this matrix. No, that has to be dismissed out of hand as though nothing were stated, whatever. Otherwise, we have undermined all of our knowledge. We can never have confidence or certainty in anything we believe. It must connecting it again to another essay by Peikoff that we talked about, certainty and happiness, as you mentioned. Without a dismissal of whim from human cognition, all human cognition is doubt, is subjective. But doubt can be completely baseless. Doubt can be completely arbitrary by postulating these possibilities, just as possibilities, mind you. And they pose as objective. They pose as lovers of knowledge. Well, maybe, but no. Until and unless something has been cognitively connected to our context of evidence, there is no reason and no ability to refute it, because you can't disprove a negative any more than you know. Now, can I prove to you that reason is our only means of knowledge, or that it's valid? No. Reason is what's required to prove anything. So any such argument would be a circular argument. However, I can use reason, I can use my observation, my concepts, my logic, to look back and see how it is that my senses connect me, how it is that my concepts connect to my observation, how it is that logic is simply an application of A as A. That can be shown. That is to say, its role in human knowledge has an empirical and logical basis, an evidentiary basis, and is not arbitrary. All of these other mystical pseudo-means are just that. Causeless claims to magical knowledge, utterly arbitrary. And which brings up another point. Can an arbitrary assertion be converted into a false one? See, objectivism regards arbitrary in effect as epistemologically worse than false. If I can say something is false, it's because it contradicts knowledge I already have. But we don't need that. We don't need to wait until we have some contradictory evidence where I can say, well, now I know it's false, to dismiss something if it's offered without any evidence, whatever. The same assertion made in a different form can be converted from the arbitrary into something with a cognitive connection. For example, traditional definitions of God are simply meaningless or impossible. An infinite being who created the whole of the universe, for example. That is nonsensical, and that cannot exist. That cannot exist. But what have I done there? I've taken this concept of God, which someone may have asserted as a purely emotional, arbitrary assertion, and I myself have connected it to a cognitive context, A is A, and shown how it's a contradiction of the basic law of identity, for example. But there, what I've done in demonstrating that at least this idea of God is false is actually connected by first trying to understand the idea and then connecting it to what I do know. And so it's not a question of the assertion as such in any case. It's a question of whether the person asserting it is asserting it with basis, has evidence for it, can connect it to a cognitive context. And until and unless that happens, it should be treated as noise, as though nothing were stated at all.
Well, that's a lot of material, James. I wanted to focus on one particular aspect of the arbitrary here, and it is the aspect that was my breakthrough when I was chewing this concept of arbitrary first. So it is the fact that arbitrary can only occur on the conceptual level, not on the perceptual level, because as you've pointed out just now, if you do not you can reduce you can reduce true ideas to perceptual evidence. This isn't possible for arbitrary ideas. So another So another difficulty that I had when I first came across this subject was grasping the difference between false ideas and arbitrary ideas. And the way I understand it is that a false idea holds a certain relationship, a false proposition. So let's be precise: a false proposition has a certain relationship to reality, which contradicts some facts, though there is evidence, at least initially, before it's been reduced to perceptual data, that this could be true. Now, arbitrary idea is not based on any evidence at all, and true idea is the opposite of the false, whereby there is evidence for this proposition being true, and if reduced, you'll be able to find corresponding perceptual data. Is this the right way to think about it?
Yes, I think so. The false is a negative relation to the evidence. I'm saying that there's evidence out there that contradicts it. So therefore, it's not reality. So I'm making there an assertion about my cognitive context. I know something that says this cannot be true. Arbitrary is quite simple, in much simpler in one sense. It is just an assertion made without basis. Therefore, it is meaningless in effect. Therefore, there is no connection to a context, any context, and it cannot be processed. And it's a mistake to attempt to cognitively process it. You can only mess up your mind by opening, even for a crack, that door to the whimsical in human knowledge. A crack. You'll notice here what objectivism has is a very powerful response to agnosticism. The agnostic poses as someone who's fair and objective and open-minded, wide open mind, but polluted by this Descartes direction of contemporary philosophy that allows for arbitrary possibilities to be considered. The agnostic thinks, well, until I can refute the idea of God, maybe there's a God. And so the agnostic poses as someone who's completely objective in one sense, fair in one sense, open-minded in another sense. But of course, they totally miscalculate. They have completely rejected objectivity by allowing in a possibility, an arbitrary possibility. That is exactly the error of the agnostic. He allows in to his thinking, right, the possibility of the arbitrary. But if he can do that about God, then he can do that about anything. And I mean anything in the range of his knowledge, the field of his knowledge. There is nothing that can be known with clarity, with certainty, I would say even with possibility or probability, if we can introduce the arbitrary into our thinking. So what the agnostic does is he caves in on knowledge as such. He's thrown in the towel on certain knowledge as such. He has undermined cognition as such. He is allowed in the door, in fact, theoretically, he's allowed in the door any possibility, any flying spaghetti monster. And so, in effect, the agnostic is acknowledging the possibility of any whimsical doubt, and thus undermining all of cognition in the process.
Right. And that brings us nicely to the super chat question, which was sent in by Anne. Anne says, what check is there to ensure objectivists or others don't arbitrarily declare things arbitrary as an excuse to avoid answering hard questions? And I'll just start by presenting my answer to this. And I'll say that it is precisely what we've just said. It's by reducing things to perceptual data. And so, yeah, I just have to say that by so you don't. So the question is, how do you not basically just like how is declaring things as arbitrary not a free a blank check on refuting anything? And the answer is, well, if somebody does declare something as arbitrary, whereas it's not, perceptual evidence should be presented as means to reduction.
That's the essential answer. It really is. But let's concretize this with a specific example. The concept of God.
Mm-hmm.
Thomas Aquinas, back in the 1200s, offered five. He was very impressed with Aristotle's logic, and therefore he thought, oh gosh, I need to use Aristotelian logic and observation to demonstrate the existence of God. In fact, he argued that you couldn't get the entire subject, the entire field of theology off the ground until you'd established in reason that there was a God. And so he famously offered five proofs for the existence of God. Some of them were partially observational arguments. Look at a tree. Look at life around us. There seems to be this teleological purpose to the whole universe, and that seems to suggest a designer, a God to him. Now, that kind of an argument is not an arbitrary argument. It is a deeply mistaken argument. He is wrong, but when he makes an argument of that kind, we cannot dismiss it as arbitrary, even though it's the same concept that we might dismiss as arbitrary given in another form. For example, if someone else says, yeah, I've read Thomas Aquinas, that's not why I believe in God, has nothing to do with why I believe in God. I believe in God because there's this inner feeling that I have, and that's all I have is this emotion. And you asked me what evidence I have? Well, I don't think I need evidence for that proposition at all. I have no evidence. I have no logical inference from evidence to give to you. I have no basis to connect it to your cognitive context. I just feel it's correct. Now, if a person asserts the existence of God like that, they are asserting the arbitrary. They are asserting something which must be dismissed out of hand. There is nothing to refute, unlike Thomas Aquinas. See, he connected his concept of God, at least in a false way, to a cognitive context. Look at your observations of the world around you, to the complexity of living organisms, to the teleological nature of life, and therefore there appears to be some grand purpose. Okay, that's an argument that needs logical refutation precisely because it is not an arbitrary one. It's very false, but at least it purports to be based on some observation and some logic. So the answer to the question is, the objectivism draws a very important distinction here. It doesn't say that it's a function of the idea or whether we disagree with the idea. It's a question of its status. An evil idea, totally evil idea, may be just outright false, and if we have a good argument for its outright falsehood, we should make it. Stomp on it. On the other hand, if there really is no reason in the first place, right? So the question is, how is the argument asserted? How is the concept proposed? How is the proposition made? It's a question of the epistemological basis offered, if any, and that's what we distinguish. So it's not a question of it being a bad idea for objectivism. Bad ideas in one context might be arbitrary. In another context, they may be demonstrably false. So objectivism just doesn't say, we disagree with this, therefore it's arbitrary. Objectivism says we disagree with this, we may be able to demonstrate its falsehood all over the place, or it may just be asserted without any evidence at all, in which case I'm not even going to respond. I'm going to treat it like the squawking of that parrot.
Cool. And this brings me to a question that I personally had for you, James. So is there any difference in treating arbitrary ideas in the context of polemics and in introspection? And what I mean here is, so Aristotle has this eloquent saying that it is a mark of an educated man to entertain an idea without accepting it. Now, should arbitrary ideas be entertained by somebody, i.e., is it a good practice to project what an arbitrary idea would do to your knowledge whether it would undermine your knowledge, whether what have you, doesn't really matter. Is this something that should be done by one, or is it something that should be rejected straight away without any further consideration?
Well, the key word in Aristotle's statement there is entertain. What do we mean by entertain? If by entertain an idea that we're not going to believe in, but we can entertain it, how are we entertaining it? If we entertain, and this is again going back to the answer even to the last question, entertaining it may mean discovering that it's arbitrary, locating, oh, I see there's really no basis in fact or evidence for this, and entertain it to the point of discovering that it's arbitrary, and then stop. Mm-hmm. And is it important to understand what the arbitrary is and how it can damage the rest of your knowledge? The whole of cognition, the whole of your knowledge can be undermined by the insertion of even just a micron of the arbitrary? Yes. So if I'm entertaining this idea that I'm not going to believe in at the end of the day, and all I'm doing is identifying it as baseless and understanding further, which I think is important, the danger, the life and death quality of of accepting even the possibility of the arbitrary. If by entertaining we mean, and it's interesting because the entertaining sort of encompasses all of it, we mean its absolute refutation, my ability to say, no, that's clearly not true, or it looks like it's not true. Then, of course, the broader concept entertain also applies to falsehood. So entertaining an idea that we end up not believing could be merely its identification of the arbitrary and the important recognition that the arbitrary undermines all cognition. That is important. And that's why we dismiss out of hand. See, it requires no further entertaining once we've identified it as arbitrary. However, the false is something we can further entertain. It contradicts this that I know and this that I know, and it involves a self-contradiction and over here, and I can't be integrated to the rest of my knowledge over here. Now I know it's false. You see, it depends on what we mean by entertain in that Aristotle assertion. Mm-hmm. As for introspection, direct introspection, has the same status as sense perception observation in objectivism. That is to say, if I'm directly aware of a process of my consciousness, for example, I directly experience a memory or an emotion or something, the contents of my consciousness, the immediate contents of my consciousness are observable, just as a ball is, the roundness or the blueness of a ball is observable.
Okay. And can we take a concrete example? We brought religion before, but you can take another one if you want, and really observe what internalization of this arbitrary idea into a man's consciousness does to one's ability to think and to deal with reality.
Well, the agnostic is in a perennial state of doubt about everything, isn't he? The example of God was a good one, but we can use all kinds of other examples. I mean, they're endless, aren't they? I mean, there are people who will, in the face of a century of communism, say that communism will outproduce the capitalistic West any day now. We will produce a workers' paradise with unlimited material and technological prosperity, despite 100 years worth of evidence, right? So a person can assert something and then say, for example, if he's not even going to listen to your refutation, to him those facts don't matter. I don't care what the economic statistics show. I don't care what the history of the last 100 years show. He has now divorced himself from a cognitive context of evidence. He doesn't care about the evidence. And therefore his assertion about communism is perfectly arbitrary. There is nothing to argue with there. There's nothing to refute there. It's just treat it as if nothing is stated. Now, consider the state of mind of that guy. If he is capable of doing that with his political belief, communism, and divorce it from the evidence altogether, what can't he do? What emotional preference of his, which again, we're coming back to, arbitrary assertions are usually based on just emotional effusions. Yeah, that's the only other psychological process available. He wants to believe in communism. There's nothing but his desire to believe in communism there that's even on the table. No evidence whatever. And think of it. Can he contain that view? Can that view be contained, isolated from his view of human psychology?
I don't think he can contain it, because he'd have to constantly evade that knowledge, and with every evasion move further and further from reality.
And there you have the real final answer, right? He has undermined his entire cognition. Everything he knows is now in doubt. Arbitrary, baseless doubt in many cases, even though he's wedded to this one arbitrary idea. But just one arbitrary idea cannot be contained. It will have this carcinogenic, metastasizing effect that will spread and spread and spread malignantly throughout your cognition. It necessarily must. He's undermined his ability to think and know as such.
Yeah. So these are all the questions that I have had, and I wanted to ask you whether you wanted to stress anything else before we close.
Well, I do want to come back to a very simple fact about objectivism. It is the first philosophy in the history of human philosophy, as far as I'm aware of, to take the primacy of existence seriously. That existence exists and only existence exists. And in so doing, it insists that there be evidence for any topic of actual cognitive processing. You cannot allow whim into your thinking process without throwing a monkey wrench into the entire process, as we've just said. Objectivism rejects whim in human thought, and therefore corrects the dramatic error that Descartes made when he started the project of modern philosophy in the 1600s. It corrects a mistake that we have been suffering from in philosophy for the last 400 years, thanks to this belief in arbitrary possibilities. And it has undermined human cognition by giving us baseless doubts, undermining our confidence, even though human knowledge is a reality, even though the power of human knowledge in recent centuries, since the Industrial Revolution, has been demonstrated over and over and over. We land rockets on a dime on the moon every time. We cure diseases. We come up with vaccines. We split atoms and release the power of stars. The power of human reason and knowledge is real. Knowledge is real. But all of that power, all of that truth can be undermined. You can absolutely nuke a person's confidence in the whole of their knowledge if we permit any whim, any arbitrary into our thinking, whatever. So the way I would have it is say, objectivism is really the only philosophy that defends reason as a valid basis for knowing. And it can do so only because it takes seriously the idea that existence exists and only existence exists. That's the way I'd summarize it.
Okay, great stuff.
Do we have any other questions?
We don't have any more super chats, and I have really it's a wonderful topic. It's one of most fascinating, and as we've said before, one of the most distinctive ones of the objectivism.
Definitely.
On this note, I wanted to thank the viewers. I wanted to thank you, James, for being with us. Please consider becoming a member of ARC UK. Though there are great many reasons for doing so. Also, like the video if you like this content, and subscribe. Otherwise, have a good weekend, everybody.
Thank you. Take care.